Hey everyone, this is section 4 of the introduction, Sean Matgamna's Introduction to the Fate of the Russian Revolution, Lost Texts of Critical Marxism. This section 4 is titled Max Shachtman and James P. Cannon. Section 1 is titled Max Shachtman. The author of most of the material in this volume is Max Shachtman. His texts champion the Russian Revolution and revolutionary socialist politics with incomparable verve. Through most of the 1930s, Max Shachtman played a role secondary only to Trotsky in propagating revolutionary Marxism. But by the time he died in 1972, Shachtman had moved far from such politics. Sometime in the later 1950s, Shachtman became convinced that revolutionary politics in the USA were not, quote, operational, end quote, in the foreseeable future. Like the Workers' Party, which Shachtman and others founded in 1940 after breaking with Trotsky over Russia, and its successor, the Independent Socialist League, Shachtman believed it is to be his duty to help the American working class develop a mass political party of the sort the British Labour Party then was, but with better politics. In 1958, the Independent Socialist League liquidated itself into the tiny Socialist Party, and soon Shachtman and his friends controlled that party. The Democratic Party, since Roosevelt, had the active support of most of the trade union movement. Soon the Socialist Party was working in the broad Democratic Party for a strategy devised by Shachtman. They would take the American working class a giant stride forward in politics by transforming the Democratic Party into a labor-controlled party. In effect, a labor party. How? The racist Southern Democrats, whose affiliation to the Democratic Party dated back to the Civil War, would be hived off. Shachtman became a sort of operational Fabian, working behind the scenes to manipulate developments in the trade unions and the Democratic Party in the direction he thought would best serve the next stage of working class development on the road to a socialist consciousness. In this guise of American Fabian, Shachtman helped organize the civil rights movement. He had at the beginning described this Democratic Party realignment strategy as, quote, foul and discreditable work, end quote, but necessary. In pursuit of a, quote, opening to the right, end quote, which dominated the labor movement, he himself moved on to the right wing's political terrain. How much was initially a pedagogical adaptation, I do not know. He worked with the existing trade union leaders, whom he had once justly described as agents of the ruling class, the labor lieutenants of capital. In an exact replication of the fate of the USA's, quote, right communist, end quote, grouping of the 1930s, headed by J. Lovestone, many of Shachtman's supporters became part of the trade union bureaucracy. Shachtman ceased to believe in a, quote, third camp, end quote, of the working class and oppressed people throughout the world, and opted, like the other, quote, orthodox, end quote, Trotskyists, only on the other side, for one of the two great camps in the world. Shachtman chose the camp led by the USA. Like the working class itself, as a revolutionary political force, the, quote, third camp, end quote, existed only as a potential, as something to be won, worked for, propagandized about, wrought in the class struggle. Shachtman insisted on that against those who felt impelled to stand with however critical a demeanor in Stalin's camp. After the crushing of the Hungarian Rising by Russian tanks in 1956, increasingly Shachtman gave up on it. He accepted liberal capitalism as a, quote, lesser evil to Stalinism. Shachtman believed that the imposition of Stalinist regimes, which would stifle and destroy the labor movement, and democratic freedoms won over decades and centuries, as Stalinism did everywhere it ruled, was to be resisted, on pain of death for the labor movement, resisted even in alliance with liberal bourgeois and American imperialist forces. Section 2. This is section 2 of the Max Shachtman section. In the post-war world, where the USSR was the second great global power, recognition that the USA and Western Europe advanced capitalism was the more progressive of the contending camps, the one which gave richer possibilities, greater freedom, more for socialists to build on, was, I believe, a necessary part of the restoration of Marxist balance to socialist politics. It was a prerequisite for the reconstruction of Marxism after the systematic destruction of concepts over a whole period. The destruction began with the early 1920s conversion of Bolshevik Civil War exigencies into revolutionary law, and culminated in the final ideological convulsions of Trotsky. But reconciliation with capitalism in the manner of Shachtman in his last years was no necessary part of it, any more than it was for Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto, when he rejected the, quote, reactionary socialist, end quote. Marx was able to analyze the progressive work of British rule in India while also opposing it. Lenin could write, quote, can anyone in his senses deny that Bismarckian Germany and her social laws are, quote, better, end quote, than Germany before 1848, ... Did the German Social Democrats, ... vote for Bismarck's reforms on these grounds, end quote. Lenin. For Marx, for Lenin, and for the classical Marxists, to recognize something as, quote, objectively, end quote, progressive, did not at all necessarily entail supporting it or endorsing it politically. Their task, as they saw it, was to educate, organize, and mobilize the working class, and help the working class to utilize the working class's opportunities, not to promote progress in general and abstraction from the class struggle. Thus the idea of defending even bourgeois liberty against Stalinism, which was an international extension of the tacit alliance revolutionaries might enter into with liberal bourgeois forces against threatening reaction, did not necessarily imply surrender of working class independence, or demand of revolutionary socialists that revolutionary socialists should commit harikari for its sake. Shachtman drew conclusions he had never drawn in the fight against fascism. Shachtman joined the democratic capitalist camp. At the time, 1962, of the CIA-backed Cuban emigre invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, Shachtman broke with those of his comrades Hal Draper and Phyllis and Julius Jacobson, and others who would continue to stand on Workers' Party and Independent Socialist League politics. Shachtman thought that a Stalinist Cuba, where no real labor movement could exist, was the greater evil and backed the invaders. Shachtman's hopes for the development of the Democratic Party into a party controlled by the labor movement floundered as Lyndon B. Johnson's America got drawn deeper and deeper into war in Indochina. A war of mechanized slaughter reeked from the air. Reached from the air indiscriminately on Vietnam and Cambodia. Shachtman believed that only behind the bulwark against Stalinism, which the USA thus provided, could the forces that would resist Stalinism on the basis of progressive politics and democracy be given a chance to emerge. Shachtman backed the USA. Shachtman died of a heart attack on the 4th of November 1972, as the USA was preparing to, quote, bomb Cambodia into the Stone Age, end quote, which it did, leaving the ultra-Stalinist Khmer Rouge as murdering kings of the ruins. The folly of relying on U.S. imperialism against Stalinism could not have been more horribly proven. At his end, Shachtman stood as a negative example of the need for the politics he had defended for 4 decades, socialist working-class independent politics. Yet his writings continue to stand as an immensely valuable positive embodiment of such politics. To my understanding, that's like one of the main things that the third camp why the third camp opposes both the first, what they would call, could call the first and second camps, is that the advances of either of those second camp encourages the other camp, right? So this notion, this idea that the ultra-Stalinist Khmer Rouge, as the murdering kings of the ruins, after the United States, quote, bombed Cambodia into the Stone Age, end quote, was a result of America bombing Cambodia into the Stone Age, right? The idea is that, like, which I think is true to my, not expert, but to my understanding, it does seem plausible that the victories of U.S. imperialism stoke Stalinism. Make people sympathetic to it who might not be sympathetic to it to begin with, as the only possible defense against American imperialism. Anyway, Section 3 of the Max Shachtman section. It is only from the point of view of the so-called, quote, third camp, end quote, that is, of the consistently independent working-class politics which he did so much in his time to clarify and defend, that Shachtman can properly be evaluated or justly condemned. Those who opted for Stalinism, however, critically as a progressive anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist force were Shachtman's mirror image, only in the, quote, in the other, quote, camp, unquote. Those who supported Vietnamese self-determination against the USA were right to do so, but many of us too blithely dismissed the concerns that led Shachtman to his, quote, foul and discreditable, end quote, course, because, in the last analysis, we accepted that Stalinism, the force for now fighting imperialism in Indochina, was also progressively anti-capitalist. Who the hell is we? I don't know if he's talking about himself in his Trotskyist, in his earlier days, or not. I think they opposed the war, but I don't think they took the. I don't think like the American Third Campus, say like Phyllis Jacobson, Julius Jacobson, and Howard Draper. I don't believe that they viewed the Stalinist, the Vietnamese Stalinist forces as progressively anti-capitalist. But I'm not sure. Maybe they did, but I don't believe so. Nor were Shachtman's machinations to find a road forwards for the mass labor movement necessarily discreditable. Even if one thinks the strategy for turning the Democratic Party into a labor party unlikely to succeed, or simply fantastic, and the techniques employed by Max Shachtman and his friends to help engineer it suicidal for socialists, it does not follow that dawdling in sectarian aloofness, still less doing that while basking in imaginary reflected glory from foreign Stalinist dictatorships, is thereby certified to be the best socialist politics. Shachtman's efforts to avoid relegation to the role of passive propagandist have merit, even if one emphatically disagrees with his actions. Nonetheless, Shachtman at the end was deeply mired in conventional American dirty bourgeois politics. The man who had, with some justification, denounced James P. Cannon's conception of the Revolutionary Party as owing too much to the conventional U.S. machine, quote, boss, end quote, politics, died in the company of the real machine politics, quote, bosses, end quote. His section of the Socialist Party in effect supported Richard Nixon in the election that was held a week after Shachtman's death. This end to Shachtman's political life must for socialists cast a dark shadow on his memory. There are those eager to make sure it does, who use it to discredit his ideas and his struggle in the 40s and 50s for rational revolutionary working class politics. That is, to develop the real heritage of Trotsky. Is not so simple or straightforward. The position of Hal Draper and his comrades, their resistance to Shachtman's course, and their break with Shachtman would alone refute the canard that Shachtman's end was implied in his differences with Trotsky. Shachtman, when he took himself into the camp of American imperialism, did not take his life's work with him. He could not. Against his future self, Shachtman had laid down immense barriers of passionate reason, unanswerable logic, truthful history, righteous contempt for turncoats and faint hearts, and scorn for those who in middle age make peace with capitalism, the capitalism on which in their braver youth they had declared war to the death. Shachtman's, quote, third camp, end quote, writings are the best commentary on and the best condemnation of Shachtman at the end. Those writings, and the writings of Shachtman's comrades, are an important, indeed a unique part of the capital of revolutionary socialism. Arguably, I would so argue, they are the lineal defense, elaboration and continuation of Trotsky's ideas. That is, of unfalsified Marxism, as they really were, and as they really were developing at Trotsky's death. These writings are a precious part of the heritage of revolutionary socialism. In the post-Stalinist world, they are no small part of the seed from which an unfalsified socialism will be reborn. There are parallels. Lenin advocated that the literary remains of George Plekhanov should be kept in print and studied by socialists. Plekhanov, one of the greatest and the first of Russian Marxists, had backed the Russian Tsar's war in 1914-18. Lenin also advocated that the pre-World War I work of Karl Kautsky should be treated in the same way. So should Shachtman in his work. Isn't it to aggrandize Shachtman and his comrades too much to bracket them with Plekhanov and Kautsky? On the contrary, it is to risk understating their importance. Plekhanov and Kautsky were very talented and accomplished participants in a large school. The group of which Shachtman was the political leader and the outstanding writer were the rear guard of an overthrown and ruined political civilization, which they worked to preserve and restore. It was a political world in which Stalinism fostered amnesia, charlatanism, spiritual darkness, a world in which socialism was eclipsed by vile fraudulence, and the old socialist movement had been engulfed by political barbarism. Shachtman and Shachtman's comrades kept alive Marxist method, culture, political memory, and the aspiration to working-class liberty in the age of political barbarism. Even their nearest brothers and sisters, the quote orthodox and quote Trotskyists, who despite their faults and inadequacies had great merit of their own, were infected and tainted by the forces dominant in the labor movement during the Stalinist Dark Age. Neither Plekhanov nor Kautsky was irreplaceable in his time. There were others as good or better and a large movement from which they could be expected to emerge. The work Shachtman and his friends did was irreplaceable in their time and place. No one else did it. They were part of no big school of thought. They had to resist the gravitational pull of far more numerous forces of, quote, official, end quote, Trotskyism, itself caught in the gravitational pull of, quote, communism, end quote, in order to do their work. Most who called themselves Trotskyists misrepresented them then, and have since tried to obliterate the memory of the work Shachtman and his comrades did. Making these writings accessible is a necessary part of rebuilding socialism in our time. Nor are the literary remains of Shachtman tainted, except in the eyes of those who want them to be tainted, by his political end. It was not in his power to taint them. As far as I know, Shachtman made no serious attempt to repudiate his earlier work. I think that when he published his book, I can't remember what the hell the actual book is titled, but I know that Shachtman did change, they were Bowdlerized text, meaning that he made a collection of essays and changed them to be more consistent with his current political views. Anyway, so he did, I don't know, he might not necessarily repudiated them, but he definitely changed them. Now it's easy for us to go and look up what Shachtman actually said in, journals like New International or Labor Action or like the Socialist Workers' Party Internal Bulletin or shit like that, and see what he actually wrote at the time. But in the early '60s, when he's re-releasing these essays, no one would, unless you had like the copies of those magazines and newspapers and journals on hand, it would be very difficult to go back and look at them. I mean, it would be very difficult to go back and compare and contrast them. And you might not even think to do that unless you could get the impression that something had changed. Anyway, the small prefaces he wrote in his later years to editions of Trotsky's books put out by Ann Arbor Press, Terrorism and Communism and Problems of the Chinese Revolution, make criticisms of the Bolsheviks no more stringent, though one-sidedly put, than what he said, I think justly, in The Mistakes of the Bolsheviks in November 1943, Chapter 1 of this book. Section 4 of the section on Shachtman. In the nature of things, revolutionary politics is generally a young person's game. Hope wells, reality is perceived raw, indignation is untempered by the sense of powerlessness and resignation, sensibility is uncalloused, Raw human response is uncowed, courage naive, and unchastened by fear of consequences or a sense of its own insufficiency. Age and experience make callous teach resignation. Age and experience impress the painful cost of banging yourself against walls that for now may be impregnable. Pitting yourself against things you cannot soon change, of foregoing the sustaining and comforting community of the acquiescent, of living with a raw, sharp awareness, like a nail in your shoe, that ours is a world of iniquity and intolerable injustice. The world which, yet, even when you struggle to change it, you must live in. The sense of powerlessness replaces the youthful idea that anything is possible. Vulnerability replaces the youthful sense of indestructibility. The brutal foreshortening, with age of personal time and perspective, dims or blots out the longer perspective of all collective socialist struggle. That is especially so when that struggle against capitalism and for socialism is narrowed down to maintaining a small group of socialists now and preparing the future. Then especially the sense of personal impermanence and weakening infects and saps the idea of an ongoing struggle. The desire to achieve something becomes seductive and warps and replaces the fresh, clean, young sense of what is necessary and worth striving to achieve, whatever the cost and however long the struggle. The long view and the overview give way to shorter, discrete, unintegrated views. Impatience breeds opportunism and induces indifference to the seemingly less immediate concerns. Business of achieving a little bit now displaces the old goal, or pushes the old goal beyond the horizon. So it must have been with Max Shachtman, who in addition saw the world threatened with engulfment by Stalinist barbarism. Julius Jacobson, a longtime associate of Max Shachtman's before 1961, wrote in an obituary of Shachtman in New Politics that by the end it was an abuse of language to call him a socialist at all. Yet there is continuity, especially the waning and attrition of individuals. There is a movement, whether a great mass movement or a faltering and struggling cluster of little groups. There is an accumulation of text and literature and ideas that once created, once put into circulation, are independent of the mind and the personality in which they originated and to the fate of that individual. Though individuals backslide, grow old and tired, or cowardly or corrupt, they cannot always undo what they did, unwrite what they wrote, erase the criticisms they made of class society, dim the socialist vision they conjured up, even though it has now grown dim for them. Nor can they snuff out the activities of those they won and inspired, and set to work to win others to the old ideals. Capitalist society has at root not changed Capitalist society has at root not changed, even if capitalist society's old critic has. And so it is with Max Shachtman, as with Karl Kautsky, as with George Plekhanov, and many others. That is so with Shachtman is of tremendous importance. For Shachtman, with his comrades, bore for almost 2 decades the main burden of ensuring the continuity of socialism. They knew themselves to be the survivors of a subverted socialist civilization that had almost vanished, and they knew that it could eventually be recreated by the will, energy, and dedication of socialists like themselves, acting in accord with the inner logic of history and basing themselves on the struggles of the working class. In that sense, Max Shachtman remains a great force for socialism. Okay, that's the end of section on Max Shachtman. Now we're on to section 2, the section on James P. Cannon. In many of the polemics in this volume, James P. Cannon is not only antagonist but villain. Cannon is what Shachtman is to the, quote, orthodox, end quote, Trotskyists. Lucifer, Satan. Since Cannon did more than anybody else to determine the fate of the, quote, official, end quote, Trotskyists, those who stood with Trotsky in 39 to 40, there is, I think, some justice in this. Nonetheless, it is one-sided, inadequate, and essentially unfair. Cannon was no villain. Cannon was and remained a Marxist working with ideas on Stalinism he took from Trotsky and conceptions of socialist organization that proved wrong or inadequate. Cannon insisted on calling himself a, quote, agitator, end quote. indicating perhaps a too modest conception of his own capacities. At the same time, he had too much confidence and too much self-assurance that he knew it was what, in the field of socialist organization, and far too much assurance that it could be sufficient. Cannon would, according to Shachtman, say to his intimates that he was a Trotskyist in his politics, but a, quote, Leninist, end quote, in organization. Shachtman plausibly argued that Cannon's organizational notions have been shaped by the mid-20s Zinoviev-led Communist International. It's funny because I'm reading like a bunch of different things on this topic at the same time. I was reading reviews of this, and one of them was by Haberkern, Ernest Haberkern, who edited the volume Neither Capitalism Nor Socialism: Theories of Bureaucratic Collectivism, which is a more diverse but shorter collection of articles by people operating within this tradition. And he basically says something to the effect that, like, Trotsky's Leninism was, in terms of, like, political organization, in terms of, like, organizational questions, was basically Zinovievist, which was a proto-Stalinist, which I don't really know what the fuck that means, but that's actually certainly very interesting to think about. I'd need to know more about Grigory Zinoviev in terms of his influence on world affairs. He was like the head of the Comintern, I know that, and but I don't really know much of his influence on 20th century socialist / communist politics. The factional battle in 1939-40 and Trotsky's death left Cannon the undisputed leader of the biggest Trotskyist organization, and the one which the Fourth International would regroup at the end of the war. To Cannon and those who could find for work fell the task, if they could do it, of liquidating Trotsky's political errors and repairing his tardiness in reevaluating the USSR. But Cannon was tied as by an iron shackle to the logic of the local workers' state that would remain a comparatively progressive force no matter what it did so long as the economy remained nationalized. In response to the World War experience of Stalinism, Cannon might have chosen to follow through on Trotsky's 1939 and his own indication of the need to revise the whole position. Cannon chose instead to follow the logic of, quote, totalitarian economism, end quote, through to the end. Possibly Cannon was a late casualty of the 1939-40 faction fight. Cannon had spent too much energy denouncing the indicated changes as criminal, quote, revisionism, end quote, and betrayal of the, quote, program of the Fourth International, end quote, to find it easy work. The continuing competitive struggle with the, quote, Shachtmanite, end quote, Workers' Party did not make it easier. There's perhaps a suggestion of relief in the way in which Cannon, in late 1941, seems to have accepted that the destruction of the USSR had virtually been accomplished. There can be no doubt that Cannon hated and taught others, the writer, for example, to hate Stalinism, but ultimately Cannon chose to tie himself and those for whom he had the authority of guardian of Trotsky's legacy to, quote, progressive, end quote, Stalinism. Cannon chose to freeze the movement politically and theoretically at the point Trotsky died. Cannon used his authority after the war to, quote, appoint, end quote, and back official theoreticians who extrapolated and developed in a scholastic spirit socialist perspectives from the existence of the anti-capitalist Russian Stalinist empire and the new autonomous Stalinist states such as China. Cannon reconstructed the Fourth International after the close of discussion in the 3-year transitional period after 1945. As a monotendency sect, around the frozen Trotsky of 1940, in a world that had not remained frozen, Cannon played little traceable part in the theoretical reevaluation after 1945. Cannon could not have done worse than those he licensed and endorsed. The Catholic Church is a mutated piece of the bureaucracy of the later Roman Empire that has floated down to our time through a number of different types of society. The typical, quote, official, end quote, Trotskyist organizations shaped and influenced by Cannon's organizational conceptions can be seen collectively as a fragment of the mid-20s Zinovievist Communist International. Even where the comparatively sizable organizations have been built, they've been politically sterile. Thanks for listening. That's been section 4 of Matgamna's introduction to the fate of the Russian Revolution.